with a short introduction. Λοιπόν, καλησπέρα. Σας καλωσορίζω στην απογευματινή συνεδρία, στην οποία θα μιλήσουμε καλώς ή κακώς στα αγγλικά, καθώς έχουμε τους καλεσμένους μας που δεν μιλούν ελληνικά, εκτός από το Στέλιο Γιαμαρέλο. Οπότε θα το γυρίσω τώρα στα αγγλικά. We are very glad to have with us three esteemed scholars in their fields and scholars that open new directions in architecture and historiography. I will begin my short introduction before introducing you our scholar, our invited speakers. So, in a short trip to Athens in 1959, a young Kenneth Frampton encountered for the first time the Greek polykatoukias, the typical mid-rise apartment building type, which form Greek urban landscapes. And as he recounted in his introduction to Ioanna Theocharopoulos' book, Builders, Housewives and the Construction of Modern Athens, he was left, quote, impressed by the extraordinary continuity and sense of urbanity emanating from this seemingly endless aggregation of 5 to 7-story apartment buildings, ingeniously integrated within the existing urban fabric. He publicly expressed his enthusiasm much later, though, a few years after he had used the term critical regionalism in his introduction for the 1987 Greek translation of modern Greek architecture and critical history, where he highlighted the polykatoukia as a uniquely modern manifestation of urban growth stemming from the spontaneous evolution of the society rather than from planned intervention. At the time, other approaches were also appreciating the positive aspects of Greek urbanization. For instance, in the 1986 summer issue of the journal Ekistics, both Peter Allen and Karl Patton discussed how Athens provided mechanisms to enable people to create their own spaces, and they described the polykatoukia as a sort of proof that people could design without architects and planners. Still today, Antiparachi's legacy subsists in this largely visual, iconographic realm, typifying the polykatoukia as a regional realization of the Corbusian domino system, combining tradition and modernity, design autonomy as well as collective value. To be sure, the prevailing today idea that both the typical Greek polykatoukia of Antiparachi and the Greek cityscape are unplanned and spontaneous constructions owes as much to Frampton's theoretical assumptions as it owes to the wave of criticism that emerged in the 1960s against the homogeneity of the international modern and towards the aesthetic appreciation of anonymous architecture. This criticism was typified by Rudowski's Architecture Without Architects, Amos Rappaport's House Form and Culture, Paul Oliver's Shelter and Society, and others. Inasmuch as it may be valuable to see the polykatoukia as a bottom-up architecture and the Greek urban landscapes as a spontaneous evolution, though, it may be far more important to unpack the histories of the different actors who took part in this bottom-up evolution. Recent international literature offers a refreshing understanding of regional and ad hoc architecture, placing it within multiple theaters of legitimacy battles among professionals, architects and planners, bureaucrats, and informal bodies of agents. For instance, the recently published book of Farhan Karib, Of Greater Dignity Than Riches, in his book, What Becomes Evident is that an ad hoc architecture of housing for all in India, based on simple design and materials, was intertwined with multiple types of politics and, most importantly, with the production of national identity in the recently decolonized country. Helen Kiger's book, Improvised Cities, Architecture, Urbanization and Innovation in Peru, published the same year in 2019, presents self-centering programs and practices in Peru between the mid-1950s and the mid-1980s, and the involvement of architects like John Turner and the country's governments in guiding them. Both these studies share a new interest in the architecture of housing, or more generally of homemaking, in the countries of the so-called global periphery, where the unsettling rapid demographic growth took huge dimensions, and where the Western conceived high art claims of centrally designed architecture were faced with a whole new series of challenges. Thus, these authors' interest necessarily goes beyond the conventional Western Europe-centric narratives, interestingly adopting an innovative interdisciplinary approach which involves the study of the ethnic and social contexts and oral history. We tried to follow these promising directions for architectural historiography in our research program, Αντιπαροχή and its Architects, Histories of Social Forces, Spatial Politics, and the Architectural Profession in Greece, 1929-1974, held at the School of Architecture NTUA and founded from the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation and the General Secretariat for Research and Technology. The project looked at the evolution of αντιπαροχή, the land for flats type of contract, which is the main reason for the spread of the Greek flat type of πολυκατοικία. In particular, the research sought to contextualize the multifaceted relations between the various subjects involved in the phenomenon and the institutional formation of the architectural profession in the country by utilizing previously unexplored archives related to wide-ranging historical issues and with a special emphasis on oral history. Overall, the research offered new insights into Greece's post-war development and its spatial aspects, as well as various social integration policies and consensus building practices. And from a targeted architectural historiographic point of view, it traced the different professional challenges and opportunities faced by architects against commonplace building practices and the emerging commodification of housing in the country. Today, we have the opportunity to position these findings within the recent state of the art literature, and we are very glad to have three scholars who have opened new ways of studying architectural and urban history. Each adopting a different perspective, they all contribute a lot towards understanding architecture as a lot more than just a high art institutionalized cultural discipline, and towards intersecting new evidence and narrative in architectural history. Stelos Giamarellos, lecturer in architecture at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL, suggested a very intriguing cross-cultural reading of the formulations of critical regionalism for Greece in his recently published book, Resisting Postmodern Architecture, Critical Regionalism Before Globalization, published by UCL Press in 2022. Today, he's about to discuss how the history of modern Greek architecture, and I would add of Greek urbanization, became known to an international audience after the globally celebrated reception of Kenneth Frampton's book, Modern Architecture and a Critical History. Now, we know that among other projects, Frampton found the typical qualities of critical regionalism in a πολυκατοικία, designed by the renowned architectural firm Atelier 66, headed by Dimitris and Susanna Antonakakis, the Polykatikia at Benaki Street, Athens. After long discussions with the architects, we discovered that they designed at least 23 polykatikias with a system of antiparachi in Athens, and quite a few in other Greek cities. They also regularly redesigned plans of apartments at polykatikias under construction, as the contractors would sell apartments off the plan to finance construction. From the 1960 to 1984, this was an original routine for Antonakakis practice. But Frampton most possibly never learned about this production. Of course, as the architect told us, designing the plans of polykatikias at the request of 19 different antiparachi contractors in Athens was a condition of survival for their firm, and in most cases, they could hardly impose their ideas during implementation. Yet, as they told us, this practice was crucial for them to formulate their architectural ideas. For them, the polykatikias were a perfect exercise in style and composition. So the question posed by Yamarellos about how and how much Frampton knew about Greece and its architecture is a critical question here, and we are looking forward to hearing Yamarellos' speech. Sarah Melchens, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Akron and editor of the international peer-reviewed journal Architecture Beyond Europe, conducts innovative historical research about the Indian city of Pune. For her research, she makes extensive use of oral history and documentary material retrieved from unexplored private collections. Melchens examines in particular speculative modes of house building, of which architecture is kind of banal and commercial, and yet Sarah suggests that these cases affected architectural patronage and the quotidian tasks expected of architects and built architecture itself. And she draws attention to previously unexplored archives and fields in architectural historiography, such as building regulation, oral history, and bureaucratic correspondence retrieved from previously undisclosed architects' archives to reveal what she calls the hidden histories of the built environment. Yael Alvein, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning at Technion, Israel, and Head of the Housing Lab, author of the book Homeland, Zionism as Housing Regime, 1860-2011, published by Routledge in 2017, is about to suggest a re-theorizing of housing as architecture. Yael discusses how the mechanisms of housing financialization since the end of the so-called era of development transferred the responsibility for housing provision from the state to global markets, corporate monopolies, and the dwellers themselves, assigning architects legal agency to develop new methodologies for housing as a cultural product. And she attempts to, in a way, bridge this gap by inserting new terminology and methodological tools for historical research. Today, Yael Alvein will focus on her research on housing for the greatest number in Tel Aviv and the value of architectural design therein, for a period that spans from 1921 to 2021. So, thank you once again for joining us, for being here to present your work. And we will start from by Stelios Yamarellos' speech. Thank you.
Okay. Ακούγομαι? Εκεί πίσω? Ναι, ωραία. Χαίρομαι πάρα πολύ που είμαι εδώ. Δυστυχώς πρέπει να μιλήσω στα αγγλικά. Θα έχει πιο πολύ πλάκα να τα πω στα ελληνικά. But that's the way it is. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Kostadina, for inviting me to this event. I'm very glad I was here in the morning to listen to the findings of this research program. I guess I'm here because I'm very much interested in the mechanics of history writing, and I think that's a thread that might connect us with Sarah and the discussion afterwards. As Kostadina briefly mentioned, I will focus on the story of critical regionalism, which has kept me busy over the past decade. And just to briefly summarize this story, this is how it goes for Greek architects, at least. In 1981, Alexander Jonis and Liane Lefebvre shaped the concept of critical regionalism around the work of Susanna and Dimitris Antonakakis. The two authors claimed that the Antonakakis work combines two distinct kinds of regionalism in 20th century Greek architecture. One of them is expressed in the architecture of Aris Konstantinidis, with a systematic use of rectangular grids. As they say, the grid is the discipline which is imposed on every space element. And the other kind of regionalism is exemplified in the work of Dimitris Pikionis, with his use of topographically sensitive pathways, or in the author's words, the location of place elements in relation to a movement. And with a project such as the apartment building on Benaki Street, the Antonakakis combine the systematic grid of Konstantinidis with the topographic sensibility of Pikionis' pathway. And in doing so, they also transgress some of the utopian and nostalgic connotations of their predecessors' work. Their architecture is rooted in the lived experience of a specific place, Athens, here and now, neither in the past nor in the future. And this is what makes their work critically regional. It becomes a kind of realistic intervention in the Greek socio-political condition at the moment of its production. That is what Jonis and Lefebvre were going on about. And soon afterwards, Kenneth Frampton, who read that text, integrated the term critical regionalism from this article in his own texts on similar topics that he was working on his own, at least until the late 70s. And it is because of this text that the architecture of Konstantinidis, Pikionis, and the Antonakakis found its celebrated place in the second revised edition of Modern Architecture: A Critical History in 1985. And rather crucially in this book, the Greek projects serve as the conclusion. They're the last examples that Frampton discusses in his new chapter on critical regionalism. So there is a suggestion somehow that these Greek projects could help in successfully addressing the long crisis, the long impasse of modern architecture since the 1960s. Now, since then, since the mid-80s, Modern Architecture: A Critical History is easily Frampton's bestseller. Over the last 4 decades, it has been revised and translated in more than 10 languages, from Spanish to Chinese, so covering large numbers of the global population, and it still serves as the main textbook in architectural history courses across the world. And this global outreach magnified the significance of the book for Greek architects. It was the first time in half a century that contemporary Greek architecture had been included in a globally celebrated history of modernism after Alberto Sartori's survey of functionalist architecture of the 1930s. And this inclusion was additionally significant because Frampton wanted to adopt a very polemical stance. With his last chapter on critical regionalism, he aimed to intervene in the crucial architectural debates of the 80s. So after being included in his book in 1985, architects who had been working in a relatively isolated way, none of these architects, unlike Doxiadis or Kandilis, other well-known Greek architects at the time, but who were known only for projects that they were doing outside of Greece, these architects had never built outside of Greece, and suddenly they found themselves at the forefront of international developments in modern architecture. And so the good news for Greek architecture meant that the translation of the book was very soon underway. And in his preface to the Greek edition, as Kostadina just mentioned, Frampton went further to describe Athens as a whole as the modern city par excellence. And mainly he suggested that Greece should be proud of a city that was at that time not especially appreciated, as we saw in the morning, and an architecture that was usually ignored by its residents. At the same time, Frampton edited a monograph on the work of the Antonakakis in Atelier 66, and that included a short introduction by him and a substantially revised version of Johnny's and Lefebvre's The Grid and the Pathway. For these reasons, Frampton became the favorite historian of Greek architects. He was regularly invited to contribute with short texts when Greek architecture was to be presented to a local or international audience in exhibitions, monographs, other publications. And in the eyes of local architects, he was the international spokesperson for the country's marginalized modern architecture. Had Frampton not recapitulated critical regionalism, both Greek architecture and Johnny's and Lefebvre's ideas would not have enjoyed such global exposure. The Western world became familiar with modern architecture in Greece from Frampton's vantage point, that of the mediated outsider, of the Englishman in Athens. But how was this view historically shaped? In the preface to the Greek edition of his book, Frampton presented Greece as a locus that shaped him as an architect and critic. His relationship with the country goes back to October 1959. This is when he first walked on Pikionis's recently completed pathway around the Acropolis, without knowing anything about its architect then. In the 1960s, he visited Greek friends on holiday trips with his partner, and over the next 2 decades, he continued to visit the country frequently on several occasions. Here are some undated archived sketches from his travels, which show that specific building details attracted his interest, and these ranged from balconies to window shutters and the whitewashed outlined stone pathways of the Cycladic Islands to the sculptures of mythical animals on top of Pikionis's favorite vernacular house of Alexandros Rodakis on Aegina. Frampton's lifelong link to Greece throughout the 20th century was the Greek Cypriot architect Panos Koulermos. As a token of his appreciation of his friend, Frampton edited the posthumous monograph on the work of Koulermos after spending quite some time into the architect's archive. The two architects actually met as colleagues very early on in the early 60s, working at Douglas Stephen and Partners in London. And this period was significant for Frampton because it marked his first steps not only as professional architect, but also as a historian, a critic, and a technical editor of architectural design from 62 to 65. Koulermos helped Frampton to liaise with Konstantinidis when he edited the monographic feature on the Greek architect's work in May 1964. In the decades that followed, Koulermos and Frampton stayed in regular correspondence, and through Koulermos's long letters, Frampton retained a good sense of everyday life in Greece over the 60s and the 70s. In 1972, Koulermos invited Frampton to participate in an international workshop on environmental design, which included contribution by significant local architects such as Konstantinidis, but also Takis Zenetos. During the workshop, Frampton also attended a lecture by the Greek sculptor Theodoros. And the British historian's handwritten notes testify to his fascination with the sculptor's claims. Theodoros argued that, and I quote, "Any technological form of art is situated at the arrière-garde of the technology of today." End of quote. He also discussed how the photogeny of the work of art had become indispensable to its global dissemination, leading to a fundamental differentiation of our artistic sensibility. That was the sculptor's words. A decade later, Frampton's writings on critical regionalism transposed Theodoros's notions about sculpture to the field of architecture. In his widely read text on critical regionalism of 1983, Frampton famously insisted on the crucial role of an arrière-garde that could both eschew a mindless technological optimization and resist the reduction of architecture to a single photogenic image. He could reclaim it as a fully embodied space of public life and collective expression. Through his editorial role at Architectural Design, Frampton also established his connection with the publisher Orestes Doumanis, the magazine's Greek correspondent since '65. In 1967, Doumanis started publishing the annual review Architecture in Greece, and through a network of Greek architects in London and Athens, including Aristidis Romanos, Yorgos Simioforidis, and Savas Kondaratos, Frampton's texts were consistently translated and published in Greece throughout the 70s and the 1980s. Through Doumanis' annual review, the British historian also expanded his networking with Greek architects. Frampton read The Grid and the Pathway shortly after its original publication in Greece. Since the early 70s, he had been consistently in contact with Johnson and Lefebvre. The couple themselves had sent their updated manuscript of The Grid and Pathway to Frampton in October '82 and stayed in regular correspondence as they collaborated for the monograph on Atelier 66. They also consistently followed the British historian's text on modern Greek architecture throughout the 1980s. Now, adopting Johnson and Lefebvre's views on the work of Greek architects, Frampton adds Pikionis and the Antonakakis to his anthology of regionalist architects he had been compiling himself since the late 70s. But his early texts for Greek architects also document his weaker ties with their work. The last pages of his book, The Reason for Greek Architects to Celebrate, are essentially an extensive excerpt from The Grid and the Pathway. As an outsider to the Greek context, Frampton finds it more difficult to trace cultural nuances in the work of Pikionis and the Antonakakis. In these cases, he largely follows Johnson and Lefebvre's interpretation. Still, he tries to see it in broader theoretical terms and not strictly as historically embedded design patterns. He respectively regards the grid and the pathway as an alternative formulation of Paul Ricoeur's distinction between civilization and culture, or the clash between the technological scientific framework that is potentially universalized across the globe with the human sense of belonging that is developed by different societies and their mythical nuclei. Frampton resorts to theory in order to address an endemic problem of the cross-cultural aspirations of his critical regionalism. To build an architectural discourse on cross-cultural grounds, to be able to adopt a nuanced dualist perspective, one ideally needs to be familiar with the specificities of at least two contexts. And this is why Frampton's outsider discussion of Pikionis' work is less insightful than the informed insider's interpretations by Johnson and Lefebvre. Although Frampton trod Pikionis' pathway around the Acropolis in 1959, he does not really add anything significant to Johnson and Lefebvre's account. And although he had also visited the Antonakakis apartment building at Benaki Street by 1983, he is limited to describing it only as, and I quote, a layered structure wherein a labyrinthine route drawn from the Greek island vernacular is woven into the regular grid of the supporting concrete frame. And that's all really he has to say about the building. Frampton was less interested in Greek architecture than in the ways in which it could be integrated in the wider project of overcoming the crisis of modernism. Now, when Frampton worked on the Atelier 66 monograph, he also contacted other historians of Greek architecture, such as Anthony Antoniadis, who was then professor at the University of Texas at Arlington. In their exchange, Antoniadis shared his objections to Johnson and Lefebvre's accounts. He noted that despite the Antonakakis' left-sounding rhetoric, their architecture is costly and, more importantly, does not address problems on the larger urban scale. As such, and I quote, it represents only one aspect of Greek architecture, one which photographs very well and has ties with part of the Greek past, yet one which has done very little to solve the larger problems of Greek architecture today. Antoniadis' texts on Pikionis were also helpful for Frampton when articles on modern Greek architecture by local scholars in English were difficult to trace. And that was what Frampton got to know about Pikionis and the Antonakakis. But the case of Konstantinidis was different because the British historian had been familiar with his work since the 60s when he edited the special issue of Architectural Design. And that's why Konstantinidis had already found his place on Frampton's list of regionalist architects before the publication of The Grid and the Pathway. This familiarity also enabled Frampton to go beyond Johnson and Lefebvre's account. This is where he had something new to say. And to illustrate his critical regionalism, Frampton discussed the first house by Konstantinidis in Elefsina, built in 1939, and his designs for a garden exhibition in Kifissia in 1940. Neither of these projects was discussed by Johnson and Lefebvre, But these are the projects that enabled Frampton to differentiate his interpretation of Konstantinidis' work and to escape the exclusive framework of the grid in his later texts. I will return to this later. In many cases, many of Frampton's insightful additions to Johnny's and Lefebvre's work are mediated by the work of his Greek students in New York. As such, it's not entirely clear how Frampton can claim that his contact with Greece shaped him as architect and critic. While he regularly visited places, buildings, and people in Greece, it is the network of his Greek-born colleagues, researchers, students, and acquaintances in London, New York, and Athens that effectively conditions his understanding. As an outsider to the Greek context, Frampton relies on secondary sources that are available in English to develop his thoughts on the local architectural scene. In the late 70s, Aris Konstantinidis' son, Dimitris, was one of Frampton's graduate students at Columbia University. Not only did this refresh the British historian's ties with the Greek architect, but it also enabled him to obtain a rare copy of Konstantinidis' book, Elements of Self-Knowledge, in English. Together with the monographic feature that he edited for architectural design in May '64, this book remains Frampton's main primary source on the work of these Greek architects from the 80s onwards. And his primary sources on Pikionis were even more limited. Alexandra Papageorgiou, who wrote a graduate student essay on the work of her grandfather, Dimitris Pikionis, also translated some of his texts into English. And together with Sentimental Topography, a significant essay that was translated for the Pikionis exhibition at the Architectural Association in 1989, these texts constitute Frampton's only primary sources on the sophisticated work of this Greek architect. So in his successive texts on architecture in Greece from the 80s onwards, Frampton consistently reproduces the same excerpts from this very limited pool of sources. And for this reason, he also cannot double-check the validity of his secondary sources. Earlier in the 80s, for instance, his student Dimitris Varangis discussed the focal role of the courtyard in Pikionis' residential projects. Frampton quoted this part of the essay in his own text, together with his students' overarching interpretative framework of the development of modern architecture in Greece. Frampton's extensive notes on his students' essays show that such texts helped him to understand the Greek architectural scene or select specific projects for monographs. Today, Frampton's hesitation to write more about architecture in Greece is evident in the publication of the 5th edition of his book, and the archived notes related to what became an 8-page chapter on Greece are very short and less well-researched than Varangis' essay from the 80s. Based on the same references across decades, they do not reflect the development of a more nuanced understanding of architecture in Greece. So Greek architects who wore their inclusion in Frampton's texts as a badge of honor have rather unrealistically regarded him as an insightful authority on the subject. But the British critic did not consider himself a historian of Greek architecture. Now, despite these structural shortcomings, Frampton's contribution to the global history of critical regionalism, and especially its relationship with Greece, remains uncontested. Owing to his mediated relationship with the local architectural scene, Frampton could add new insights only when he saw new works by the same architects in exhibitions and publications in which he was somehow involved. His additional observations were usually based on this novel material, which Frampton consistently tried to associate with other Western European references. This is his rather overlooked but still significant contribution to the discourse of critical regionalism. Frampton's subtly different readings of the Greek architect's work pushed the historical specificity of the grid and pathway interpretation into the background to highlight his own theoretical priorities. His introduction for the monograph on Atelier 66 is more outward-facing than the inward-looking account of Johnny's and Lefebvre. It is also aligned with the Andonakakis' own baffled response to the strictly regional genealogy that was propagated by the Greek and the pathway. Frampton refers to Le Corbusier, Aldo van Eyck, and Mies van der Rohe as an equivalent thread of influences in the work of the Andonakakis, and as such, even though this is again a rather intuitive interpretation and not a historically documented one, it does foreground the dual face of the Andonakakis' work that had been overshadowed by Johnny's and Lefebvre's very emphatically local grid and pathway schema. Now, Frampton's interest in the cross-cultural aspects of critical regionalism becomes more apparent in his later text. In his most comprehensive study of Konstantinidis' work to date, the British historian argues for potential references to Japanese architecture in the Garden Exhibition project in Kifissia in 1940, and these can be similarly traced in the late work of Pikionis. In the same text, Frampton also discusses the Archaeological Museum of Ioannina, but contrary to Jonis and Lefebvre, he does not focus on the exemplary use of the grid, but on the way in which Konstantinidis situates his building in the existing topography. In other words, Frampton notes the topographically sensitive aspects of the work, and he implies that Pikionis' pathway somehow can also be traced within Konstantinidis' austere grids. And as such, his account enriches the critical regionalist interpretation of Konstantinidis' work. But on the other hand, his exclusively phenomenological reading of Pikionis' work emphasizes just the solitary experience of the moving body through an undulating topography. And this is why it comes across as less successful than Jonis and Lefebvre's insistence on the ritualistic, socially engaging dimension that rests as the core of their interpretation of the pathway. But even when some of Frampton's interpretation for the larger scale diverted from or simply distorted the socio-political condition in Greece, they proved to be historically useful. His clearly formal reading of Athens was nonetheless the first well-known and unequivocally positive appreciation of the modern city par excellence by an architect. The significance of this statement for subverting the negative predisposition of Athenians, who used to describe it at the time as a monstrous city of cement, and leading to the appraisal of Athens on its own terms from the late 80s onwards, cannot be easily measured. Above and beyond the individual projects, Frampton's regionalism aspires to stay true to the progressive and liberating promises of the modern project. For this reason, his selected regional practices also need to be somehow generalized in order to render them more relevant and operative for diverse architectural practices across the globe. To extrapolate and theorize the general point of this design practice more effectively, Frampton has in turn needed to downplay or bypass some historical specificities of the critical regionalist projects. This is how a regionalism that has not yet emerged elsewhere could acquire significance for the world outside itself. Frampton's ready access to major publishing venues at the Western European and North American centers of architectural theory production, such as Oppositions and Architectural Design, have further reinforced this sense of global relevance for his selected critical regionalist projects from the so-called periphery. Greek and other regional architects of the period experienced this global dissemination of their projects as empowering. On the other hand, this move away from history effectively short-circuited Jonis and Lefebvre's original intentions to arrive at an architectural theory that emerges primarily from a focused return to regional specificities. To avoid the paradox of neutralizing these architectures through theoretically abstracting and extrapolating his main points, Frampton also needed to tread a fine line around their historical and cultural specificities. His portrayal of Athens and Greece as a whole exemplifies this complex entanglement of an outsider's critical regionalist account in the history-theory nexus. For the North American and Western European audiences, Frampton's Greece became a unique locus of modernism in a postmodern world. Because it historically developed following the normative models of 19th century neoclassicism and 20th century modernism, Athens is inextricably linked to the modern project. This is Frampton's argument. Rather schematically, the British historian attributed the widespread acceptance of modernism in the Greek context to the coincidence of the purest formal play of white volumes under the sunlight with the regional vernacular of the island settlements. But rather crucially, Frampton continued, modern architecture in Greece did not produce a universally optimized generic built environment. The variegated topography of the region meant that each project needed to adjust to a specific and in most cases irregular site. In other words, modernism was universally applied in Greece only because it was also locally modified. This is how several areas of modern Athens retain a sense of the island settlement despite the overarching urban grid of the normative general plan. In conjunction with this landscape, the strong natural light intensifies the phenomenological perception and existential qualities of people, places, and things in Greece. Whether he refers specifically to Athens or to Greece as a whole, the modern grid and the fragmented urban experience of the island settlements are the main categories through which Frampton understands the architectural production of the country. And because he leans to this kind of phenomenological reading, Frampton tends to essentialize instead of historicizing architectural production in Greece. Despite the declared intentions of their author, the British historian studies of the early 80s do not address the specific sociopolitical context, and it is only in the late 90s that Frampton gains a fuller understanding of the process behind the modern phase of Athens. Again, this emerges from the research of one of his Greek doctoral students, Ioanna Theocharopoulou, and it is the local modalities of culture and production, the way in which the fragmented ownership of small plots of land interacts with a small-scale Greek construction industry that results in the seemingly unself-conscious achievement of Athens as the modern city par excellence, Frampton's words. But it is important to note that, for example, a practice like the Antonakakis defined their critical regionalism precisely through their opposition to this same popular small-scale but ultimately private and commodified modality that produces the city that Frampton idealizes. And this mismatch is another symptom of a structural feature of Frampton's discourse. In his critical regionalism, theory consistently comes before history. Because he puts theory first, Frampton also tends to ignore other projects by the same Greek architects that do not fit within his aspired critical regionalist framework. For him, critical regionalism is a theory that aims to oppose the reduction of architecture to an isolated scenographic image. But even his own architectural discourse ends up utilizing local projects as contextless images, because these seem to satisfy the general aims of Western theorists of the time. While modern architecture in Greece is finally out of the margins, the contexts and the conditions that define it as critical regional are absent. And for these reasons, the famous points of critical regionalism were not adopted as guiding principles for architecture in Greece. Because they are only superficially related to the concerns of Greek architects on the ground of their everyday practice, they do not provide specific directions for the future. To a great extent, the discourse around critical regionalism continues to determine the ways in which architecture in Greece is received to date. But this also limits the related discussion to a series of projects from the 70s. In the particular case of the Antonakakis, this means that a major part of their work, which spans approximately 4 decades after the first theorization of critical regionalism, is not included in the big picture. The so-called periphery did not become a locus of architectural and discourse production, which is regarded as significant for the central debates. Critical regionalism remains the central debate that defines the terms of the discussion in the periphery that absorbs it, much like modernism and postmodernism before it. So for the above reasons, the mission of a historian of critical regionalism today is different to that of its original theorists in the 80s. From the early 2000s, a succession of studies that seem to spring from Keith Egener's critique have traced the specific social and historical contexts and the original local architectural intentions and modes of production that hide behind the veil of the critical regionalist debate. Without the limitations of the pursuits of the 80s, without necessarily believing that one writes the manifesto for the humanistic architecture of the future, critical regionalism can become a cross-cultural historiographical agenda of the so-called periphery today. And the writing of this cross-cultural history of critical regionalism, which started with an Englishman in Athens, can potentially be undertaken from the reverse vantage point of a Greek-born architectural historian in London. Thank you very much. No, thank you.
Thank you, Stelios, for this very interesting discussion of how an architectural theorist can ignore basic and very important facts in the formation of an architect and the formation of the work, and how he even selects to not include, even if he knows some of these facts. and how in this way architectural theory is formed and a whole idealization of the built environment and architecture is created. So it is an important task indeed to try to revisit the mechanisms of writing architectural theory and question them and reveal the paths followed by these architects, which are very important in Greece and beyond, Dimitris and Susanna Antonakakis. So we will move on with Sarah, who is joining us online. We just have to switch on the Zoom link so that we can see her. Now we can see you, Sarah. Okay, we can hear you too.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here in the closing session of your symposium. And I want to thank Kωνσταντίνα and Professor Turnigiotis for the invitation. Today, I will take you through evolutions in everyday housing projects by unsung architects in the city of Pune in Western India. This will reveal how dynamics between local building policies and market demands shape the architect's notions of professional competence and their built forms. India is interesting here and somewhat stands in contrast to the Western European and American contexts because of the wide acceptance and prevalence of modernist aesthetics in run-of-the-mill building projects. This is something it shares not only with many other countries in the global south, but also, as today's discussions on antiparochy revealed, with Greece. In India, as elsewhere, this bread and butter modernist architecture has been largely overlooked. Over the last 3-4 decades, a rich body of scholarship has drawn attention to modernism's regional manifestations in India and challenged the dominant position of Western modernism in historiography. But these studies mostly engage a discussion of so-called high architecture. These sophisticated works by acclaimed architects are more often than not produced in exceptional circumstances. By that, I mean that they were mostly commissioned by the state or by private elites and designed by architects who had the opportunity to study abroad and work with master modernists such as Le Corbusier, Kahn, and the likes. And while it is true that celebrated post-independence Indian architects like B.V. Doshi adapted their modernism to India's context, they did so while they still upheld the universalist idea that architecture had transformative power and could shape a new post-colonial Indian society. Reality on the ground, however, is that most Pune architects and engineers and contractors too earn a living by the design and production of unassuming modernist buildings which do not reflect individual authorship or autonomy, nor lay claim on grand societal engagements. Lineages of these middle ground housing typologies continue to define India's booming cities today, but their significance and that of their producers has been underplayed in historiography and discourse. And that brings me to Pune's unsung architects and why I think a better understanding of their work is also important. It is important because it tells us a different and more grounded history of Indian modernity. A history which allows to see that architecture, more often than not, rather than shaping society, is itself shaped by it. To allow such a narrative to develop, my research approach has been to analyze built form, but also and especially look into processes of design and production. Thus, apart from buildings and their visual representations, I extensively rely on oral histories, bureaucratic correspondence in office archives, and popular literature. They make clear that architects are not just creative authors, but also workers who are bound in a set of social relations and regulatory frameworks that are place and time specific. The first of two firms I want to introduce you to today is Architects United, established in 1961 by B.V. Sharma and V.V. Godge. Both had been classmates at the Architectural College in Bombay, a city which since the 1930s had been the center of the discourse on modernist architecture in India. In the late 50s, when Sharma and Godge were completing their architectural studies, Le Corbusier and his team were working in Chandigarh. Godge and Sharma were thus most certainly exposed to disciplinary debates on modern architecture. But it also is important to note that unlike most elite architects in India, they did not study abroad or work with an influential proponent of modern architecture. They started their practice when they were only in their early 20s. Residential work was crucial in the first decade of Architects United's practice, when 77% of their commissions were related to housing. An overwhelming majority were assignments to design freestanding houses for the local middle class, known as bungalows. Although they were all designed in a modernist vein and in the same period of the 1960s, two clearly distinct approaches can be identified. A first approach prevailed in bungalows for clients from the higher middle class, highly educated professionals, high-level government employees, or businessmen. These bungalows are indicative of an experimental approach to modernist architecture based on functional and climatic considerations. This was reflected particularly in the facade, but also in the spatial configuration and use of buildings. This bungalow for Dr. Ra, for instance, has an elegantly designed front porch with butterfly canopy providing shade for the main entrance and the client's car. The house is also subtly raised on a plinth and offers a playful composition of colored planes and protruding surfaces, partly acting as awnings to shade the windows. The roof parapet, which hides an accessible terrace, consists of opaque and metalwork railings in a symmetrical position. For the mansion designed by Ms. Schroff, the horizontal continuation of its eaves around the building and the carved out carport give the building a Wrightian character. Other bungalows on private plots have similar experimental features, such as planters integrated in the roof parapets and cantilevering steps. However, a second approach and more subdued form of modernism characterizes Architects United's bungalows that were part of so-called cooperative housing societies. The cooperative society housing model involved a group of residents jointly acquiring a land and organizing the construction of housing. This allowed them to benefit from the advantages of scale, and large plots, often form of farmland, unaffordable for a single buyer, suddenly became available for the middle class through these cooperatives. After the building phase, the cooperative societies continued to function as service providers, providing common facilities to their members. The sudden spurt in cooperative housing activity in Pune in the 1960s was the result of the initiative of various cooperative banks and the government to provide beneficial loans to cooperative society members. The government also worked out supportive legal frameworks for the management of these cooperative housing societies. Cooperative bungalows by Architects United were less varied and almost simplistic in their facade designs. Fenestrations often consisted of isolated smaller windows, protected from sun and rain by a singular cantilevered awning on the top. Accentuated building plinths had disappeared, and form variations in the concrete awnings, as well as the roof slopes, became the main elements to bring individuality to each bungalow. Decorative features were restricted to ornamental grooves in the facade rendering and the highlighting of protruding elements with colored paints. Tellingly, and in contrast to the bungalows designed for private plots, Architects United did not photograph these bungalows, nor do their archives contain any perspective drawings or scale models of these cooperative commissions. The designs combine pragmatic aspects of existing building customs, such as the veranda access or small-sized windows, with a restricted contemporary material palette to achieve a somewhat unresolved but decidedly modern aesthetic. Interviews indicate clients that would commission cooperative housing were often public sector employees. These employees not only had a more limited capital to spend, but often held transferable jobs and were posted in temporary positions all over the country. Many cooperative members had no intention of immediately occupying the bungalow. Economic designs that allowed for a phased construction and subletting were thus often a requirement of these clients. For instance, in the design for a cooperative bungalow displayed here on the left, this was a design which circulated in a popular pattern book. The kitchen and wet areas were intentionally located at the center of the plan, instead of their traditional location at the rear. So that, I quote, the house owner could let out the bedroom and the veranda to a newly married couple with the view to cover part of the monthly installments payable to the government for the loan, interest, and insurance, end of quote. The design also accounted for the future addition of 2 more floors, and the rear veranda was proportioned to accommodate a staircase. But it were not only such client demands that resulted in the subdued modernism of cooperative housing societies. The role of the architect in their production process was also particular. Architects became involved in neighborhood planning. They laid out a street pattern and plot divisions. This also meant that their administrative and coordinating role increased significantly. On the one hand, they managed the multiple plot owners of the housing society. On the other hand, they engaged with a wider range of government agencies for the subdivision of land, registration of cooperative societies, and obtaining of building permits. In addition, the architects filled in the major part of the loan application forms to be submitted by members of the society to the financing organizations. Each loan application required the architect's area surveys, approved building plans, a detailed estimate, and building specifications. In order to speed up these administrative procedures, several plot owners often appointed the same architect, and architects sent out collective tenders for the construction work. The bungalow designs was such that the general contractor could execute buildings in their totality, and thus avoided the separate tendering to specialized contractors or their coordination, as would have been the case for the bungalows on private plots. Such an approach then necessarily reduced the scope for architectural experimentation, and a standard typology emerged. It was not long before cooperative housing societies emerged in the form of apartment buildings on more compact but centrally located plots in the city. This was the first such project by Architects United. It consisted of 2 identical buildings that were a stacking of identical apartments configured much like the cooperative housing bungalow plans. This repetitive layout attributed equal flats and shares to all members and relieved administrative pressure on the architects. Moreover, repetition facilitated a speedy construction process. In the facade detailing, however, the architects spared no efforts. As was the case for high-end bungalows, the planar elements of the awnings, balconies, and roof terrace form a dynamic and unconventional composition. The fact that the architects also made a hand-drawn perspective view and photographs of the completed building attests to the significance they accorded to the building. Here you can see a photograph of the facade on the left, and on the right is an apartment building Architects United designed around the same time and in the same neighborhood, but for a new type of client, the speculative building contractor. Ambitious building contractors started to act as intermediaries between cooperative society members on the one hand and landowners and Architects United on the other hand. First, they would secure land, and this often happened under similar arrangements as the antiparochy concept, whereby owners of bungalows would be offered new apartments in the building. Then contractors would ask architects to develop a project on paper, and only afterwards they identified buyers. While this was in essence speculative building, they would still register with the government as a cooperative housing society, so that buyers could avail of financially and juridically advantageous cooperative housing legislation. The emergence of this new type of actor within the building industry was the second major external event that prompted a transformation in Architects United's professional practice and influenced their engagement with modernist residential architecture. As you can see, construction details employed in the facade, such as the unusual slit windows, disappeared in the apartments for speculative contractors. In their work for developers, the architects gave up the pivotal coordinating and administrative role they had worked so hard to gain over the previous decade. Their role in managing the construction process was also reduced. Since their client was a contractor, tendering procedures were no longer required and construction site supervision happened only at crucial moments. The second architectural firm whose work I want to discuss today is Space Designers Syndicate, a firm established in 1980 by P.S. Deshmukh and Z.R. Sheikh. Just like Architects United, these architects were locally trained and started their practice as young graduates. The conditions in which they started, however, were quite different. By the late 70s and early 80s, the socialist government realized that its previous efforts to act as a direct provider of housing, and especially of social housing, had failed. This was mainly due to a lack of funds and the divided interests of various government agencies. At the same time, policymakers saw how speculative entrepreneurs were capitalizing on the increasing demands for home ownership in the private market. As a response, in 1976, the government issued a controversial law known as the Urban Land Ceiling Act. It stated that any landholder in Pune holding more than 1,000 square meters of land had to either surrender the excess amount of land to the government at the nominal rate or build and sell a certain number of public housing units at fixed rates. The immediate effect was that the majority of land available for construction was locked in calculation, acquisition, or legal procedures, which moreover was slow in the absence of clear-cut landholding records. At the start of their practice, Space Designers Syndicate were immediately confronted with demands for such calculations of surplus land. Arriving at the quantity of this surplus land was not simply a matter of assessing the areas of land that were designated as buildable and then subtracting the amount of land occupied by existing buildings. Certain areas of land were exempted from the calculations. Apart from physical or graphical measuring skills, these calculations thus required intricate knowledge of the law, which specified rather ambiguously what areas should and should not be calculated. Moreover, landowners who were reluctant to depart with their lands soon found a way to buy time. They falsely declared an intention to build low-cost housing and submitted their proposal to the authorities. In this manner, architects became involved in making proposals for fictitious projects that were destined to remain on paper. In social housing projects that did get built under the scheme, architects deftly exploited design features that would allow future expansion of the housing units beyond the maximum floor area stipulated under social housing norms. These would realize higher sale prices in the future. And they did this by generously providing balconies and designing these balconies in such a manner that they could easily be enclosed by the occupants and used as an extension to the adjacent rooms, as you can see here in the picture. A further intensification of the building bureaucracy occurred in 1982. At this point, the government decided to stimulate the redevelopment of crowded and often dilapidated tenement buildings by introducing the concept of floor area ratios. This links the permissible total floor area of a building to the total area of a plot. For most buildings, the floor area ratio was set at 1, but landlords seeking to rebuild rental accommodation were offered 25% extra permissible floor area. At first sight, the introduction of these floor area ratios, just like the Urban Land Ceiling Act, offered an innovative means of realizing social objectives despite the government's lack of budgets. But they also mark an important turning point after which the state no longer considered itself so much a direct provider of housing as the orchestrator of a legal framework that could steer private investment in housing. In practice, this attempt to control rather than execute relied on an intensification of the building bureaucracy, a bureaucracy which, through open-ended laws, was assigned a task of arbitration. And increasingly, this bureaucracy itself did not operate as a neutral body, making decisions based on objective conditions, but rather as an informalized entity granting exceptions and making perennial incremental changes to regulations and maps. Rather than sitting over drawing boards or making scale models, architects spent a tremendous amount of time engaged with seemingly banal documents such as these, which are lists of interactions with government officials and correspondence templates. The combination of incremental and ambiguous laws with speculative developments made such tools indispensable means for obtaining building permits and maximizing sellable floor space. Architects such as Pesilar's syndicate skilled themselves in clerical record keeping, developed a thorough knowledge of the latest laws and procedures, and were particularly skilled in wielding their kinship networks and persuasive reasoning in order to form coalitions and get things done. It became common practice for architects to make changes to the design during the construction phase. In one particular case, the construction of a speculative apartment project took over 15 years and required more than 3 new building permit applications after the first permit was received, because the number of permissible units had changed no less than 5 times over this period. For the many architects who experienced such interference with their designs over the course of a project, taking pride in authorship and pursuing architecture's potential to transform social was a far cry from reality. In contrast, generic designs in a modern vernacular allowed for the required flexibility. In conclusion, what I've hoped to demonstrate with this brief genealogy of housing in Pune is that the architecture of everyday housing cannot be seen independently from building policies and market demands. As we have seen with the emergence of speculative contractors, these policies and markets concretely reflect in modes of patronage and the processes of architectural production. In response, a large number of architects recalibrated their areas of expertise and diversified their roles within the building industry. The complexities and intricacies involved in everyday practice also make a case against all too simplifying understandings of good architecture and derivative architecture, which often still underscore our disciplinary discourse. They invite us to be humble, to acknowledge the profession's limitations, but also to make space for possible future directions of the profession, which we normally do not consider. And with this note, I would like to end.
So, thank you very much for introducing us to the theme of the liminality of architecture and housing, and the very many complex mechanisms through which housing is produced around the globe, and how architecture can hardly intervene in the process, basically. So I think Yael can continue this discussion with her speech today. So thank you very much, and we are moving on with Yael.
Go to presentation mode. Yes. Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this event, the celebration of your project, and kind of an opportunity to rethink it vis-a-vis other historical perspectives and settings. So the title of my presentation today is Retheorizing Housing as Architecture, the Value of Architectural Design in Housing for the Greatest Number, with a view from Tel Aviv, maybe reflecting on Athens, with the historical scope of 1921 to 2021, which is quite a long historical scope.
Can we just get a bit closer?
Sure. Is this okay?
I hope.
Okay. Okay, so humanity is facing an ongoing global housing crisis with major consequences for social stability in cities and nations, and by implication for the lives and health of millions. The times are seeing a reappearance of tenements, a lack of housing options, community displacement, and growing spatial and economic inequality. Theorization of the crisis in housing studies points to neoliberalization processes which have, since the 1980s, transferred responsibility for housing provision from the state to global markets, corporate monopolies, and the dwellers themselves, assigning architects little agency to develop new methodologies for housing as a cultural product. Architecture as cultural product is thus often seen as distinct from housing as socioeconomic need. This presentation seeks to propose retheorization of housing as architectural cultural production, offering a new outlook on the development of the housing crisis and on architecture's role in addressing it, by rethinking the terminology used to discuss housing and by developing the vocabulary for researching and designing housing for the general public. Okay. Doesn't work. So, never mind. Doesn't do it. No. No? Not working? Ah, okay. Okay.
So this one?
This one. So this work is part of the Retheorizing Housing as Architecture research group at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, which I led with Gara Caramelino, which was fundamentally based on historical inquiry of the terms we use for housing in specific times and places, arguing that we cannot discuss housing outside of historical context. So in referring to Frampton, this is the other way of thinking about this. We are doing a history, and from the history, we kind of extrapolate to retheorizing what is it that we are talking about. So let me start with a contemporary term, the term shitty. So in an anonymous post that was posted on the Hebrew language Facebook page Confessions of Architects in January 22, an Israeli architect stated, "I design shitty apartments. I work in an architecture office devoid of any organizational memory of designing relatively complex apartment housing, and now I'm facing a situation when new projects require creative solutions which do not come easy to me, even in my position as one of the experienced veteran architects in the office. What I mean is combining apartments in various sizes in each floor, mixed uses in each floor, and finding solutions for reasonable ventilation and effective utility rooms, which can serve variability among floors, and of course, keep the developers' building rights to the very last penny. How would you suggest improving on this topic independently?" So this confession and its anonymous venue reflect several fascinating contemporary processes in the design, development, and production of market-based housing. So one, a sudden, unexpected market demand upon architects to design creative apartments. Two, the lack of knowledge among experienced professionals in the design methods defining housing as a design problem, such as ventilation, storage, and mixed use. Three, a sense that good creative apartment design once existed, however, that the professional knowledge required to produce them was lost. Four, a sense that good design is a value for housing and that not providing good design produces shitty apartments. And five, a sense that this is a knowledge-based creative capacity required by the architectural profession as part of its premise for cultural production, and therefore the need to improve on that. The term shitty or shit to describe bad design is not limited to the Israeli sphere. As seen in star architect Frank Gehry's statement in a press conference that celebrated his Fondation Louis Vuitton, stating that 98% of what is being built today is pure shit. He later apologized, by the way. Shit, in fact, represents architecture culture's contemporary distinction between the disciplinary profession and market development. And this distinction brings us back to the period prior to modernist commitment towards an architecture premised on good design for the greatest number. So in a sense, where am I? So in a sense, shit and design for the greatest number are therefore the terms via which I will try and attempt to re-theorize housing as a mass-designed cultural project and an object of architectural design history, focusing on the case of Tel Aviv. The background for this discussion is defined by a deadlock. The architectural discourse calls upon the state to re-provide housing and solve the crisis, while neoliberal state is not interested in commissioning housing. Against this background, I examine how the architectural discipline can engage in new ways of responding to the neoliberal state of affairs, examining the entwined relation between architectural cultural product and housing as socioeconomic need. So, well, anyway, that's fine. Oh, well, never mind. So, my presentation engages with two historical periods where architectural design has served as a significant role in the cultural production of housing, contributing to several modes of value, which I will try to explore here. The two historical periods bear striking resemblances in terms of, one, exhausted market-based urban development with dire consequences for urban workers, as well as attention to housing as a design cultural product, in addition to commodity. So this places Tel Aviv in two important timelines. One is Israeli housing-based nation building, and the second is the history of housing as a modern architectural design problem. So the housing history of Tel Aviv as a housing-based urbanism is set in the context of my research on the history of Israel-Palestine as housing-based nation building, involving the gain and loss of national home via the gain and loss of individual housing, what I call the Zionist regime of housing. This long history is largely divided in three key historical periods: the pre-state or pre-city housing before state, housing before city, producing a housing-based urbanism and nation building. Then the much-studied state policy-produced housing that legitimized and consolidated the nation-state. And further, the privatized to neoliberal period of market-driven housing and expansion. In addition, we have this timeline of housing history, as we are used to tell it, to know it, distinguishing the interwar period of modernist housing from post-war period of state mass housing as a social product, and since the mid-70s, roughly, the privatization and neoliberalization of housing provision. So in terms of historiography and theory, the interwar period saw architectural response to wild market worker housing of the industrial capitalist cities and its tenement typologies, with designed built environments from the scale of the city through housing estates, apartments, kitchen, furniture, etc., aiming towards an architecture which identified housing for the greatest number as a major design problem and devised design methods to address its unique requirements, like mass production, rigorous design, seriality, democratic design, etc. This was an attempt to apply design to address the meager housing conditions of masses of citizens unattended to either by nation states or by the market. Asking why is the Bauhaus so important, Gropius declared, because it faces the problem of good design for mass production. Modern interwar housing was produced primarily for urban workers, from Vienna's red urban government to unions of sectorial workers. In line with ideas of the Arbeitsrat, for Gropius, building was a social, intellectual, and symbolic activity to level class differences and bring laymen and artists together. Housing matched the statement that art should no longer be a luxury for the few, but should be enjoyed and experienced by the broad masses, together with the Bauhaus manifesto statement that the ultimate aim of all creative capacity is the building. Addressing the problem of good design for mass production, housing was the cornerstone of the modernist contribution to modern design methods. So in addition to iconic Red Vienna and Waisenhof-Siedlung and other noted examples, we find Tel Aviv's UNESCO-declared Geddes plan for a city of 100,000 workers, its northern quarter, as one of the important cases for this project. So in 1925, Tel Aviv was at a major crossroads. Its population quadrupled in 4 years following the transition from Ottoman to British rule and the beginning of ethno-national clashes in Palestine in the 20s, which generated mass urban migration and the formation of tenements and substandard housing. These changes transformed the town from a homeowner community to a crowded agglomeration of neighborhoods with no clear structure, full of shacks and tent housing, which housed the urban poor. As non-owners, 3/4 of Tel Aviv residents in 1925 were not urban citizens. The owners, which were 1/4 of the city's residents, developed worker tenement housing as means of production while controlling the city's political system as sole citizens. The consequences for public health, municipal politics, and the city as cultural production led Tel Aviv Mayor Dizengoff to invite Sir Patrick Geddes to devise a master plan for the city in 1925. The 1925 master plan was prepared by Geddes as a city for urban workers based on the worker house as the cell unit for the urban block, what Geddes termed the home block. Geddes studied how the industrial capitalist city, which was shaped for rather than by the workers, required them to adapt to this environment in order to survive like wildlife. He was concerned that the city did not provide workers with the architectural premise, namely with the capacity of humans to adapt the environment to their needs. Geddes' planning ideas do not merely challenge top-down mechanisms, but disrupt the dichotomous perspective of modern urbanism as a clash between top-down planners and ideologues and bottom-up urban citizens. His counterintuitive idea was not articulated for Tel Aviv, but rather imbues his work since Edinburgh's tenements further developed in his years in India, the result of a conscious planning process that included proposals for 24 different cities. However, none of them was realized. Geddes explored the typology of the urban home block in multiple planning schemes for cities in India, and these culminated in Tel Aviv into well-articulated home block urban units. Urban blocks urban blocks composed of 2 rings of detached houses around the inner circumference and the outer circumference of the block. Each block included a small public park with communal facilities such as playgrounds and tennis courts. Main ways through traffic surrounded the home blocks, while narrow homeways and pedestrian ways led to the inner block without traversing it. Geddes' town planning report was adopted into a master plan containing a colored map and written bylaws drafted in accordance with the British Mandatory Town Planning Order of 1921. So here you can see the layout adopted by the city's planning department and the houses and yards cultivated by urban workers. So nonetheless, the cultural legacy of Tel Aviv, which is the first Hebrew city and model for Israeli urbanism to this day, is one of a built environment produced for and by capital accumulation. The city's significance for the production of Hebrew culture is therefore largely historicized with its capitalist legacy. Further, Tel Aviv's housing is largely discussed as a product of capital and state policy, which determine where, at what cost, and for whom would housing be produced. The modernist Bauhaus architecture designed by Bauhaus-educated architects, the backdrop for development and flourishing of Hebrew culture, languages, and identity, is shaped in its historiography of a city as a capitalist-built oasis, serving the city's one-quarter capitalist milieu. Yet, as my study shows, urban workers in Tel Aviv have shaped it as a workers' city in the 30s and 40s by appropriating the 1925 master plan and producing semi-autonomous worker neighborhoods at the edges of the plan, constructing their own houses using DIY labor and finance based on their future wages. Worker self-housing was a major cultural product in the city of the 20s till the 40s, not only serving workers' socioeconomic and political needs, but also shaping the city as a cultural representation of labor and urban citizenship. While meager, the houses enabled dwellers of the city's shack neighborhoods to gain access to proper permanent housing and subsistence farms, and transformed workers into homeowners and therefore proper citizens of the city, permanent members of its political community. This was significantly the result of sweat equity actions by the working class, self-constructing the home blocks, bypassing the expensive city center to gain access to urban dwellings by forming a network of cooperative worker neighborhoods. This process marks Tel Aviv as a city planned for and by workers and executed by means of self-governance by disenfranchised urban workers under conditions of intense commodification and urban land and housing that echo our own contemporary period. Self-built worker neighborhood home blocks dwellings all over the city were largely forgotten since they were not designed by architects. However, findings uncovered in the archives and the built environment prove that Geddes' housing scheme was fully realized by the mid-30s via sweat equity of the city's disenfranchised workers. The plan enabled Tel Aviv workers to purchase cheap small plots at the edges of the planned area, as you can see marked below in white here, which was the first such neighborhood. But the city has not reached yet. And then in a housing before street urban development process, which is still characterizing Israeli urbanism, workers, in a sense, did not wait for the city or developers to build for them, but used the plan to produce semi-autonomous home blocks in an archipelago of self-managed worker communities that corresponded well with Geddes' anarchist design principles and urban theory. After these neighborhoods at the edges of the plan were built by the workers, the city extended urban services like running water, sewage, and roads to reach them, therefore forming the layout of the Geddes plan in a relatively short time. Tel Aviv is in fact Geddes' only realized plan due to the role of urban workers in self-housing at the edges of the plan and extending its infrastructure. These historical elements of the built environment as cultural artifacts questions the cultural production of architecture and urbanism as sole premise of capital, even in the hyper-capitalist interwar period, which is very relevant for contemporary neoliberal context. In mainstream planning history, the very idea of a city planned for and by workers may seem surprising, and indeed much of the history of modern planning points to the planner as producer, and in this context, Geddes' plan represents a distinctly different approach to urban planning. While seeming a contradiction in term, this idea has produced a fascinating city and urban culture, and while attempted by Geddes throughout his career with little resonance, this idea has met the right civil partners in Tel Aviv's 1920s worker community, which searched for ways to circumvent capitalist speculation in land and housing and become urban citizens. Urban workers acknowledged the consequences of the plan for their access to housing and realized it against the interests of urban capital, producing this hierarchical set of urban neighborhoods tied together to form a city of distinct urban culture and urban institutions. Most known, perhaps, is the cafe culture, which served urban workers as meeting spaces, complementing their small houses. So, with statehood, housing for the greatest number focused primarily on the production of dwelling units, often using rationalized assessment tools for determining floor area, amenities, cost, and urban infrastructure. Housing has been framed as the architecture for the greatest number, particularly in the context of the welfare state of post-statehood, where the focus shifted essentially from architecture to number. While providing good standard dwellings to new immigrant citizens, these repetitive brutalist mass housing have generally not attended to issues of associations, identity, community, or sociability. Post-war mass housing in Israel and elsewhere posed architects and planners with a fascinating paradox. While millions of families who lost their homes during the war and migration to Israel were now housed in well-serviced modernist apartment blocks, they were unhappy with the habitats where they felt anonymized and isolated. This had significant social consequences in Israel as well as in France, the UK, the US, and elsewhere. Indeed, the failure of modern mass housing to foster viable communities is associated with and arguably triggered by the global shift from state-sponsored to market housing that began in the 70s. But did it really fail? Critiques of brutalist mass housing, even within Siam, perceived viable design methods addressing community as the main challenge of modern housing using the ethics of European New Brutalism. So while I did not study Robin Hood Gardens or Port Argo, I did study this estate, the Be'eri estate in Tel Aviv, which is a very large estate housing 192 units and a large urban block. In Be'eri, which is a single shared new brutalist estate built in 1965 on an entire urban blocks, marks the beginning of the end of the Israeli welfare state, as this estate was produced in the open market explicitly for well-to-do bureaucrats, civil servants, and professionals. While nevertheless using the architecture and urban manifestations of new brutalism in a local interpretation of Tim Ten's call to plan the city as a big house and the house as a small city. Single shared by 192 households in 2 towers in 2 blocks, the estate of 13 square kilometers includes 4 parks, 2 parking lots, inner pedestrian paths and streets in the air, and is cooperatively managed by its residents since its opening. While cooperative management provokes ongoing interresidential struggles over the shared spaces, and while surrounding neighborhoods endure redevelopment processes, this is a living example of a long-lasting community 50 years strong. The estate forms a perplexing community where residents' individual ownership and middle-class identities clash via intricate practices of shared estate management and collective uses of shared spaces. Here, identity is shaped by communal ethics and design associated with new brutalist discourse and vocabulary that provide dwellers with values of identity and sense of belonging that persist in the context of neoliberal housing bubble. Now, in the Israeli context, however, the term brutalism is identified in both professional and popular discourse with new brutalism, namely with Tim Ten-inspired critiques of brutalism. Mass brutalist architecture of the 50s and 60s, like you see on your left, is identified with the Hebrew term shikun, which is literally housing. And this terminological messiness has generated 2 fascinating historiographical phenomena. So one, a confluence of critiques meshing a focus on number with the premise of design, and therefore a deepening a discourse of failure which rejected the value of architecture in producing good habitable housing. So from the 80s until the first decade of the 21st century, there was a sharp decline in the visibility of housing as a mainstream topic in architectural scholarship, media, and education in Israel and worldwide, as you know. With their mass housing projects have seldom made it to the portfolio of notable practicing architects and were rarely included in architecture publication. As Mary McLeod put it as early as 1989, in the 1980s, most schools stopped offering regular housing studios. Gentlemen's clubs, resort hotel, art museums, and vacation homes became the standard programs. Design awards and professional magazine coverage have embodied similar priorities. The architecture of late capitalism is often discussed within the framework of a shift in architecture culture defined by the failure to bridge responsibility for social needs like mass housing with artistic creation. In his Architecture of Neoliberalism, Douglas Spencer analyzes several architectural projects to assert that neoliberalism and the architecture compliant to its agenda have produced projects designed to serve as forms of capital extraction. Spencer nonetheless avoids discussing housing as neoliberal architecture. And as housing is the fastest growing realm of real estate value extraction, hence an object of neoliberalism, Spencer makes an inherent argument here that housing is not part of architectural cultural production, which is the argument overtly stated by Gary. So if we go back to the term shitty, we can see that the paradox of neoliberal housing development is in its unfulfilled free market promise of variety and multiple choice. Rather than the rich alternative to uniform state housing, which the market was supposed to offer us, dwellers worldwide are offered with a narrow line of housing products. The privatization and commodification of the housing market has not led to a rich array of housing forms to serve the many diverse housing needs, nor a rich array of housing solutions to suit varied financial schemes. On the contrary, it seems that the global housing market created profit via the creation of scarcity, the lack in housing options, with housing being leading to continuous price hikes due to high demand. So how do we discuss design cultural objects of late capitalism? David Harvey portrays the urban setting as the key contemporary outlet for meeting capital's constant need of growth. His research harkens back to the Haussmannization of Paris as the first case of capitalist expansion via the city. As global capitalism has exhausted its avenues for geographic expansion to new markets, it now directs most efforts into intensifying urban development. Diverging from well-accepted professional principles of urban forms like density, walkability, human scale, and community, these large urban developments compromise the city and the well-being of urban citizens, as well as professional planning processes in many cities. Nonetheless, in his pioneering discussion of the culture of late capitalism, Frederick Jameson identified the role of architecture as the chief cultural agent of what we now term neoliberalism. For Jameson, architecture reflects shifts in patronage and financing involved in creating urban architecture spaces, as well as the deep changes to the social and political role of the architect versus developers and clients. Societies where social housing has dominated the housing stock provide fascinating context for studying transformations in these developments from state-produced housing for the greatest number to market-based mass housing. So while neoliberal housing for the masses have not tended to include investment in architectural design, in the past decade, we can see a new phenomenon of market investment in housing architecture from the early stages of development. So, as seen in the opening confession that I presented by this frustrated architect, architects now are called upon to assume an unexpected leading role for the design and marketability of otherwise unappealing developments compared with regular neighborhoods. So, investing resources and involving architects in the process aims to produce and market housing as a desirable product is often in an attempt to overcome drawbacks like remote location, lack of urban environment, or lesser quality spatial characteristics like high density. HH, a new housing development of large middle-class housing in the Tel Aviv area, offering 600 apartments, is a game-changing large urban development in the Israeli context. While in close proximity to several large employment and entertainment hubs and with convenient auto access to major national highways, its location amidst highways and railways produce extreme conditions of noise interference and air pollution, as well as limited integration with the desirable urban fabric. As a popular newspaper put it, a residential neighborhood combined with high-density offices right of Highway 2 facing the busy industrial zone junction, blocked from all directions between busy roads and interchanges, who would want to live in such a place? So HH therefore required a new strategy that extends neoliberal development processes which have been dominating Israeli housing production in the past 4 decades. The developers, Azorim Corporation, hired Kikabraz architects in an attempt to deal with the site's undesirable context using design. According to Braz, marketing considerations played a leading role in the design process as early as in the conceptual phase. Her design approach to the constraints of the site proposed an urban landmark with iconic architecture image in order to unify the 70-acre site and highlight its advantages as one urban block. Her design involved a study of slow exposure photography of highway perspectives, namely long continuous stripes of bright red tailings over the dark landscape, which served as the catalyst for this long facade facing Highway 2. Braz architecture converses with Zaropolo's discussion of the politics of the envelope in her design of the building's envelope as recognizable configuration that simplifies the building for clear uniform image, defining formal simplification as the organizing design principle, providing a clear logic of form. We developed a method that we call the dress, explains Braz, that strips the body of the building from its facade and allows designing the dress separately from apartment plans. While the dresser, architect in the office, designs the elements and materiality of the facade, other architects can work on the programmatic and regulatory aspects of the design. The HH dress is a structural element that, just like a dress on a human body, does not necessarily follow the body's outline. The dress camouflages the building's form, the product of functional apartment outlines and regulatory requirements, safety measures and economic considerations, by producing a complex needs-based structural outline for the floor plans far from the holistic design vision for the entire housing complex. The dress consists of 2 parts. The red ground floors that constitute a long overarching facade unifying the entire development, and the white skin springing from the 4th floor up, covering the 6 residential towers. The red slab shields 6 smaller residential structures in the inner part of the site, and you can see really a major space gap between the actual functional building and the dress. The unifying role of the dress is most expressed where it is distant from the structure, primarily along the west facade viewed from Highway 2. The full effect of the dress, seen as afar, was produced by using granite tiles painted several hues of red in a pattern carefully designed using a parametric system in Grasshopper software to optimize its 3-dimensional effect. Construction of the dress element exceeded the cost of HH by conservative estimates of 25%, compared with other Azorim Corporation's similar housing developments. Nonetheless, Azorim was willing to invest financial resources in the dress, reflecting a sense that architectural design would result in profit and value production. Itai Cohen, the real estate agent charged with marketing this estate, indicates that the appealing architecture of the estate was significantly profitable, able to contribute to the project's profits compared with second-hand apartments in the adjacent neighborhood. He points to 2 aspects of this marketing strategy that rely on values produced via architectural design: the self-sufficient character of the development and the sense of community it offers. Braz presented her design approach at the Israel Real Estate Industry Annual Conference in 2014. Under the title Challenges in Intersecting Land Rights in High-Rise Construction, she located HH at the intersection of two key architectural precedents: a street in central Barcelona embodying urban intensity and diversity with sense of human scale, and Le Corbusier's Ville Contemporaine, representing for her the entrepreneurial approach of high-rise densification with the advantages of privacy, light, and ventilation. The supersized scale of the development allows it to employ elements of classic urban grid into the large housing development, rearticulating urban form via unifying design elements that does not undermine spatial variety and complexity. The site is thus broken down by 6 pedestrian alleys which divide the built mass in 6 residential towers. I will just gloss over it quickly. And produces alleys that are supposed to represent a sense of a new urban grid within this block and locked between large infrastructure. So in addition, as the welfare state initiated public housing, it had a crucial part in the role of determining the mixture of populations. This responsibility reverted to entrepreneurial companies and depended on the types of apartments included in those developments. So if we go back to the opening confession, this requires architectural skills. The marketing agent identifies the 42 different apartment types in 6 floors and smaller boutique buildings as one of its powerful marketing characteristics, offering buyers diversified community by appealing to 3 main categories of buyers: young families who can only afford a small apartment and want the ability to expand and buy a bigger apartment later on, families with older children who may later want to move to smaller apartments, and elderly couples who want to move from the spacious villas to smaller urban apartments. This market-based neoliberal community therefore presents itself as choice-based collective home whose terms of membership are nonetheless determined by the financial capacity. And so creating multiplicity of apartment sizes and mixed use, the architects are important agents in producing this estate's capacity to produce a neoliberal community. So to conclude, discussing housing as a neoliberal product, I insist on taking Jameson's cultural analysis approach and study its cultural dimension as the primary cultural product of our time. Reintroducing design analysis into the study of housing, which is currently the disciplinary domain of planning and political economy, requires historicizing the key role of design in the very introduction of housing for the greatest number into the realm of cultural production. The history of housing architecture, together with the theory of neoliberal cultural production and extraction, offers an outlook into analysis of contemporary processes. Retheorizing the architecture of dwelling is urgent to critically assess past and current experiences and provide insights to engage with future challenges. Can this be an opportunity to reiterate the social relevance of housing and thus attract the best planners, urban designers, and architects to contribute innovative solutions to accommodate for the greatest number? What possibilities are there to engage the architecture discipline in the housing question once more? What critical approaches to the housing issue after the neoliberal turn can be used to reconceptualize the architecture of dwelling in a post-neoliberal period? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we, with Yael, we sort of moved from the historical critical approach to the question of housing and how housing is produced through mechanisms that, in which architecture finds its place with great difficulty in most of the times. Yael took us a step further and moved beyond the history to today's questions regarding housing and how we can, as architects, reposition ourselves within this 98% of production, of building production, which is which was described as city, and it can be city sometimes, but at the same time, I think that overall, all lectures helped to move beyond from the one hand, idealizations of banality in architecture and the commonplace in architecture, and then of characterizations of the commonplace and the banal as a city architecture. These the two edges of the discussion. That is the approaches that face the banal and the commonplace in architecture either as something that is purely popular and like Frampton did with Athens, that is purely bottom-up, that is expressing the popular demand and the popular will, and on the other hand, condemnations of housing, as Frank Gehry did, that say that all this production is banal in a bad way and is city architecture. So I think that all lectures help towards approaching housing and the role of architects in the production of housing in a more well-positioned way, somewhere in between the characterization of the glorification of the commonplace and the condemnation of the commonplace. Condemnation of the commonplace. I'm sorry for my English. Because we don't have enough time, we have to leave the room in like a quarter or so. So I would like to ask, first of all, our speakers if they want to comment further on the other lectures, or just continue the discussion, or whether our audience wants to address any questions.
I want to ask something about the last apartment complex that was shown to us from HH Architects. It's a more practical question, but for what like social, economical group is this housing aiming to capture? You said that it's mainly aimed for young families and for older couples, but of what economic status?
So it's mostly aiming to the lower middle class, and it is aiming at so there's a major housing crisis in Israel, as you know, globally. Housing is largely beyond the scope of most of the public, and so this unappealing site of a neighborhood enables home ownership at a lower cost than the average. But it is still middle class. Okay, so it's lower middle class, and the design was supposed to market it as medium to upper middle class. And this was mostly the role of design in making this plot of kind of an urban leftover somehow marketable, right? Somehow habitable. it actually worked in terms of if you look at the financial bottom line.
Is there any other question, first of all, from the audience? I'd like to address two issues that connect all three of the presentations of sorts. First of all, you said that at that particular project, there's a chance of families moving, changing apartments. So, what the professor from Masmaluka's earlier speaker has developed is a theory of social grading of sorts, in the Greek apartment block, in terms of the lower classes would occupy the lowest apartments and so on and so forth. And this continues up to today. So it's interesting that a socially equalizing of sorts modern movement would supposedly create something like this. And it's interesting that it's kind of, if they actually developed a marketing scheme of sorts of selling apartments or renting apartments to families that could later move on, it's very interesting how this could be turned, or how this worked. But the connection point between Sarah's presentation and Estelios and yours is the fact that we all see this modern movement, let's say, visions, appropriation, the way it's been developed in real world, and we see that modern movement can be scaled down, into smaller apartment blocks, into something that could be considered a neo-vernacular type of social housing creation. But at the same time, it cannot get rid of some elements that are basically substantial in its actual form. And the fact that when you spoke of people living in tents in Tel Aviv, at some point it's the same with Greece having refugees. Not the same, but it's a different kind of thing. Of Greece having refugees in Athens, living in slums, and then trying to find their ways into social housing, the few examples that we have. But then also we can see that the same refugees would house themselves in a way in a social housing that would be different. It would be small scale, modern looking architecture, but without the high-rise element, something that we can also see in Sarah's presentation. This is one of the few chances that we have to see examples from other countries and to discuss them. It's sad that we don't have enough time. If anybody wants to ask a question in Greek and I can translate it, or anybody can, we can do anything. Μπορούμε να αρχίσουμε πράγματα. Το λέω όντως είδα και εγώ πράγματα που δεν έχω ξαναδεί και εγώ δεν έχω τι να πρώτο ρωτήσω. Είναι πολύ δύσκολο να καταλάβουμε το μοντέρνο κίνημα πώς άφησε αποτυπώματα στις διαφορετικές χώρες, πώς υπήρξαν αναπαραστάσεις. Και επομένως, άμα έχουμε κάτι να ρωτήσουμε, μπορούμε να το κάνουμε και έτσι.
Νομίζω το άνοιξε πάλι.
No, όχι, πού πάμε γύρω. Okay, here it is. Okay, yes, I just want to add something to what Kωνσταντίνα was saying earlier, and it is more about the mechanics of history writing, really. I think it was a very nice point you made about the two extremes of the discussion, like 98% of Athens is great, for Frampton 98% of banal architecture is city for Frank Gehry. And I think it's important to note how these two statements, which are completely kind of contradictory, are coming from people with similar positions of power in existing structures of the Western world. And somehow this has an effect on what we do. So some people use these positions of power to try to reverse somehow the views, and others are kind of re-establishing the status quo. Now the thing is, I think that was kind of obvious in Sarah's presentation, that you know, Frampton's discourse, because it was stemming from this specific place, from a North American, one of the most important North American institutions of architecture, the architects that he discussed tended to create their own kind of star system. There is a sense in Frampton's discourse that there is a talented individual in each country who somehow summarizes and condenses the cultural meaning of every country. In Greece, it could be the Antonakakis or Pikionis. In India, it could be Charles Correa. And somehow, again, the discussion is centered on these figures. But because the general statement about the validity of banal everyday architecture is there, somehow the way is already open for future historians like Sarah and others to find their way into the voices that were hidden, the people who produced actually the larger part of the built environment that is the most crucial for people's everyday lives. And I think that is also what Konstantina's research program was also doing in a way. It's really looking much deeper into the conditions of production of this environment, and also moving away from all these sorts of idealizations that are somehow inherent in statements like 98% of this is good or is bad. And I think the other presentation was looking at it from their side. So how do we start developing a theory and a critique or a critical understanding of moving in today's kind of market-led environment, in a globalized environment, and understanding that the architecture of Tel Aviv or any Tel Aviv of the world is somehow implicated within this larger system. So I think it was a great kind of roundup from history to theory again, and yeah, that's what I wanted to say actually. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for your wonderful comment. I think Jan wants to...
Just a short comment. The kind of the object of, in a sense, I was talking about, so I was in a sense presenting a view from Tel Aviv, using Tel Aviv's historical housing history in a sense, in order to say something about the profession's understanding of housing as an object of design, or as a design premise, right? As one of the premises of the discipline. And so the purpose of the 2%, 98% thing is more into saying, you know, what is architecture about, right? Is it about, you know, can we just distinguish artistic production to the you know, iconic landmarks in the urban fabrics, and say that all the other you know, built environment is architecture without architects, right? Mm-hmm. Or, right? Do we have as a profession something to say and do, right? Rather than say, okay, it's you know, the fact that dwellers are architects is good enough, right? Yes. Well, it can be good enough, right? But in a sense, the modernization of the discipline involved thinking about this mass architecture, or architecture of mass built environments. And some of the work did not involve actual design of each house. Like Geddes did not design each of the houses. What he designed was a set of regulations, or a set of settings that enabled this dweller-based actual design and construction. It's
a whole new set of it's a whole new set of challenges for the architects, and they have to move beyond basically the aestheticism of design and of the production of buildings that would be, wow, like Frank Gehry's ones. They have to move beyond this and start designing in another way. And that's what Sarah's presentation also showed us, that architects were in a way obligated to move beyond to move beyond what they've learned at schools, because they had to start designing speculative housing. That was a need for them. But in a way, it's again architecture facing the challenge of designing housing. So I would like to ask Sarah if she wants to comment, and then we can close the meeting. Okay. You unmute yourself, or okay, next. Okay, great.
Okay. Yes, I think these three different perspectives really enrich the object of study. And in relation to the last point on Turnikiotis, who, rather than laying out in detail this development, formulating certain set of rules, I think it's very recognizable in what these commercial architects in India started doing, is where their house plans basically derive from a set of thumb rules, such as always using concrete frame construction so that internal walls can be changed and apartments can be joined, extra rooms can be accommodated on terraces, balconies can become enclosed. So automatically, architects kind of start offering such flexibility. But above that, yeah, I think that could be another aspect of architectural design, rather than only its aesthetic dimension.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. Okay, thank you all. We really have to leave the room. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to our invited speakers for this productive discussion. Hopefully we can continue our discussion later on. And okay, have a nice evening. Thank you very much.
Όσοι ήσασταν εδώ από το πρωί, γιατί και χθες νομίζω, θα ξέρετε ότι αυτό ήταν μια παρουσίαση στο πλαίσιο του κλεισίματος ενός τριετούς ερευνητικού προγράμματος που έγινε ως Σχολή Αρχιτεκτόνων και όπως κάθε πετυχημένο πρόγραμμα, έτσι και το δικό μας, είχε έναν αρχηγό, μία αρχηγό, την Κωνσταντίνα Κάλφα. Εκ μέρους της ομάδας την ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για τα 12 χρόνια της εθνικής συνεργασίας. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ, Κωνσταντίνα.
The question is not just simple planning. It's simple planning combining with individual creative participation and choice. Right? That's the challenge, which today, with advanced technology, 3D printing, it should be possible. I don't know when.